is Brian Horn. I am the responsible officer for TLM, and that role basically means I'm responsible for regulatory matters in relation to TLM. My background, just so you're aware, is I used to work with training providers. I've worked in an FE college, I've worked in large national training providers, and I've worked in a range of awarding organisations. But I suppose the most relevant background for this discussion is I was involved in writing the regulations, off-course regulations, a long time ago, probably about 10, 12 years ago. And I've had about, I think it's about 8 to 9 years experience working for Ofqual. And when I left Ofqual, I was Associate Director for Vocational and Technical Qualifications. So I'll just carry on, I think, because I'm enjoying myself so much. But the purpose of this webinar is just to sort of talk through malpractice, maladministration, and also to explain how to tackle it and what to do if it occurs. So I'm going to do this by running a presentation. Feel free to raise hands and ask questions as we go through. Alternatively, we can ask questions at the end and have a conversation. We could do that as well. We can do both. And if there's any questions that you want to ask privately or you want to put in messages or emails, then obviously our contact details are at the end and we can answer any questions that any colleagues might have. So what I'll do then is start this as a PowerPoint. I think, Marie, can you confirm we can all see that?
Yes.
It's coming. Okay. So I'll talk this through. Malpractice and maladministration, they're pretty much bundled in together. And I suppose the best way of describing them are bad things that happen that can damage either reputation or the safety of an assessment or an award for a regulated qualification. And it's unpacking the words bad things, and then thinking a little bit about if those things happen, how do you A, spot them, how do you know they've happened, B, what do you do, and then C, what do you do in the longer term as a result of those things happening. So let's just sort of go through the definitions of malpractice and maladministration. They are, and as I said, the purpose of today is to talk through how to prevent malpractice, maladministration in the first place, how to spot it when it's happened, how to investigate it, how to tackle it, and then how to learn lessons from it. And it's the same with bad things in life, really. Preventing them, spotting them, looking as to why they've happened, what do you do about it, and how do you make sure it doesn't happen again. So it's a sort of common cycle for any sort of quality control. But let's just go through. So malpractice is probably, I think, the most defining point about malpractice is it's something that goes wrong. But it's also defined as there's someone responsible, so it's a deliberate act, and it can either be through deliberately doing something, forgetting to do something, or doing something seriously wrong. And the type of things that you look at for malpractice are obviously the standard one would be sort of students cheating. But it would also include things like a centre who'd been given a set of approval criteria, and they didn't take those on board, or they deliberately falsified records. Now, obviously, I'm speaking up wholly in the abstract here, but these are the type of things that the regulator would define as malpractice. And what they would do is they would undermine public confidence, and they would also impact on the validity of assessment outcomes themselves. So, as I said, the clearest ones are cheating or facilitating cheating in an assessment. Now, the classic assessment that we think about when we talk about this is examinations, external assessment, but it can also mean internal assessments as well. So if a student is building a portfolio and they basically collude with another student and they copy the materials, then that material is not their own work. So it is clearly malpractice. So it is cheating. And I mean, I used to teach for a long time, and the amount of time that you read stuff that comes from Wikipedia and that type of thing, but it's that type of malpractice from a student, and also manipulation of results. So a learner might not do as well as we think, so therefore we perhaps say to ourselves, well, actually, we know this student, you know, they underperformed on the day, so therefore I'll give them a higher mark just to reflect it. It's those type of things that you will be classing as malpractice. Now, maladministration, on the other hand, tends to be unintentional. It tends to be failure in a process. So rather than someone deliberately setting out to do something wrong, something bad happens, and it does compromise the integrity of the process, and it can cause harm, but it's not a deliberate act. So that tends to be how maladministration is defined. And the type of things that you will get in maladministration are things like delays, following procedures, keeping poor records, not communicating things properly, or giving wrong information in an exchange in relation to an assessment. So maladministration, as I say, they tend to be failings, but they are not deliberate failings in the sense that malpractice is. So when you talk in regulatory terms about bad things happening, then the regulator has quite a specific term that it uses, and that's adverse effect. And an adverse effect defined by the regulator is something that affects the ability to develop qualifications properly, or the standard of the qualifications, or public confidence. So anything that damages the integrity of the qualification is described as an adverse effect. And I think the classic way of describing this is if you know that an assessment has been compromised. So for instance, let's say, for instance, you did your driving test, and you did your driving test in Birmingham at a particular centre. Now, let's say there was an issue with that centre and one or two of the examiners had been receiving paybacks, you know, backhanders to pass people. Now, imagine if you'd received your test result from there. The first thing people will be saying was, where did you pass your test? And they'd say, oh, Birmingham. And they'd say, oh, yes, we know about that. So your qualification at that point, your driving test, would not be held in the same esteem as somewhere from, say, Leicester or Nottingham, where they've got a completely squeaky clean record and no issues. So once you start to introduce public confidence issues, then clearly it damages the reputation of qualifications. So that's an adverse effect. And clearly malpractice and maladministration are linked because they will have adverse effects. And we can have a conversation later about how to deal with adverse effects, but just go through in terms of TLM's policy on this. We do expect our centres to have a maladministration malpractice policy, and we will be looking at sort of auditing those when we talk to you. So when we run workshops or we have conversations with you, then we would be expecting you to have a policy. And there's no reason why you can't look at the TLM policy and mirror it So we're not expecting war and peace. And it could be that you look at our policy and say, well, actually, we can paraphrase that. It's not for us to approve them in the sense of every dot and every cross T, and you'll write them for your own centre. But a basic policy that says this is what malpractice maladministration looks like to us. This is where the responsibility lies within the organisation to spot it and manage it, and this is how we're going to report it when we see it. So a basic policy, as I say, shouldn't be more than about 4 or 5 pages. Really, it's not a massive document. So how do we spot it? Well, we do try and train all our staff. We train our own staff. We train contractors. We do what we're doing today. We run training sessions and webinars, so that anyone involved in the delivery and award of TLM qualifications are aware of the risks and also the effects. So we run these type of sessions, and all our own staff have CPD built into their career path, which sets out that you need to undertake some training, some awareness training in what malpractice and maladministration look like and how to manage it. Now, 1 or 2 people have asked a few questions about remote arrangements. So I've put a couple of slides in at this point because it seems relevant to sort of cover this off as well. And in, I suppose, remote arrangements and remote invigilation are areas where people become increasingly worried about malpractice because of the increased risks. So I think the key point to make is, as far as the regulator is concerned, you can invigilate assessments remotely. It doesn't apply to a significant number of TLM qualifications, but as we move forward, it's worth just noting that this is a more general approach, that you can invigilate remotely in the way that's described. And indeed, the regulator sets out exactly what it sees as the key issues. So, for instance, for remote working and authenticity, this is Ofqual's words here. You can ask them to look at the room in which they've taken the assessment, and they can have photo ID and a whole raft of issues around having cameras in rooms. And all of this was explored during the COVID pandemic. So during the COVID pandemic, there are a series of arrangements that were put in place to allow for remote working and authenticity checks from AOs. And I think from the regulator's perspective, they've said to AOs, you can carry on doing this, providing the controls are in place. Now, at the end, obviously, if anyone wants to talk more specifically about remote working and checks, we can do. But I just put those 2 slides in for completeness, just to highlight that the issues have been picked up by the regulator. So, what do you do when you spot one of these things happening, malpractice, maladministration? Well, the first thing is you need to raise it with responsible officer, that's me, or you come through via Marita or any of the staff at TLM that will pass them to me. And if it is a whistleblower, then obviously we will protect the identity of any whistleblowers. That goes without saying. You should submit as much detail as you can so that we can make sense of it. And also, if there's a centre investigation and you've looked into it, then obviously anything that you've found. But clearly, any investigation, and I think it's important to make this point, investigations into malpractice are actually owned by the awarding organisation. So it is really important that you get in touch with us early doors, so that we can have a conversation with you about who's doing what. So rather than sort of hauling everyone in a room and having a mass interrogation, an early flag to TLM to say, this is what's happened. these are the issues. Then we can talk it through and we can decide who does what. And it might well be that we come back to you and say, well, that's fine. If you want to look into it, can you give us a report? Or alternatively, we may want to investigate it ourselves. So it depends on the seriousness of the issue. So what happens, there is a declaration form, and that is available on our website. And that does allow you to supply us with that information. So you can supply that in the way I've just described. And you can give us, as I say, the more detail we have, the better, because we can then decide where to go with it. So what do we do when we get this information? Well, just talk through the process. In the first instance, malpractice might have been suspected. You would either be seeking advice from ourselves, you would inform us, or alternatively, a whistleblower or informant might come to us from outside the direct structure. It could be a third party who says, I think there's an issue here. So either way, we decide at that point where we go with it. So it could either be Centre investigates, TLM investigates, or it might well be that we say, well, there's no investigation, it's not necessary, it's not a major issue that's worth taking forward. So we will do that review. Normally, if we do an investigation, then it would tend to be someone independent of the process. So it might be someone who hasn't been involved with you as a centre. In many occasions, I might do this myself because I haven't had direct contact with a centre. But they need to be independent and impartial. So what's the next process? Well, the next process is the investigation takes place. The findings, then obviously the regulators need to be informed. Now, regulators being informed might happen actually quite early. So if we receive a really serious allegation at the start, and we don't know what's going on, we might inform the regulator very early on and say, this has happened. Now, it's important to note as a centre that you shouldn't be fearful of the regulator being aware of any issues. And as I say, I used to work there and manage this process. They do not pass those type of issues on to the funding agencies or any other third parties until they know exactly what the issue is. So at the end of the day, it's almost carried out in a cordon sanitaire. So informing the regulator is the best thing to do as early as we can, and we'll obviously make that decision. But having done the investigation, the findings, again, we would normally be telling the regulator. We would also we are obliged to tell other AOs. So if it affects other AOs, then we would be telling them. So for instance, if the head of centre was found to be guilty of widespread fraud, and you also had a qualification offer with Pearson, then TLM would have to inform Pearson that what had happened. And we occasionally do get such information from centres from another AO where they'll say, well, this has happened and we've looked into it. So there has to be this exchange across AOs that we are obliged by our regulator to do that. When we also have an appeal process, so there is an appeal process there. And obviously, when we've agreed action, so for instance, you do X, Y, and Z as a result of the malpractice, the whistleblower in some instances would be informed, other AOs would be informed, and then it might well be that sanctions are applied. Now, sanctions, we have a sanctions policy, so clearly, I don't want to go into too much detail on that today, but in essence, the level of the sanction would be determined by the level of the problem. So if it was a minor maladministration issue, then it wouldn't probably go anywhere other than being recorded on an EQA report. And it might not even be necessary to inform the regulator, because if it's a delay in passing data to us, we might be saying to ourselves, well, actually, that's not an adverse effect in the sense of something that the regulator would need to know about. So there are minor issues that in many instances can be tackled quite simply without the need for regulatory involvement. But there are other things where clearly we would need to inform the regulator. So that's the process. We produce a draft report, and we check it for factual accuracy, and appeals can be made. And again, there's an appeals policy, so I won't go into that in too much detail, but there is a process whereby if we do make a decision as a result of an investigation, then it would go into appeals if you wanted to. We would take action according to the scale of the problem, and it might be that we look at an action plan. We might suspend or remove registration. There are a few things that we could do. One of the most serious things that an AO can do is revoke a qualification when it's been awarded. And we would be extremely cautious about doing anything like that. And the reason is because the regulator is very, very concerned about an AO making that type of decision, and they would want an awful amount of evidence, and it would be absolutely, the onus would be on ourselves and the centre to prove to ourselves that this award was made in an unsafe way and it shouldn't have been made. So there's a very, very high bar to remove a qualification once it's been awarded. The majority, and I'm speaking from experience looking at malpractice that's occurred over the years, and you can read this in off-call reports as well, most of the malpractice maladministration issues would be fixed with action plans. So they'd be quality improvement plans that would be put in place, and then we'd have a discussion with a centre, 5 or 6 months down the line to have a look at whether or not those things have been improved. But as I say, action plans are probably the most common way of dealing with malpractice maladministration. So that pretty much brings us to the end of the sort of formal part of this.